Hey everyone, Ed here. On June 18th, I spoke on a panel at Montreal's Climate Solutions Prize Festival 2025 with two very special guests. Naeem Merchant, Executive Director of Carbon Removal Canada and the host of the superb podcast The Carbon Curve, and Greg Baillargeon, President of BMO Quebec and Vice Chair of BMO Capital Markets. Our panel was called Canada's Carbon Edge, How We Can Lead in Carbon Removal. With two podcast hosts and one Bank of Montreal president, we decided to pass the host mic like a baton, from me to Naeem to Greg. It made for an unusual panel discussion, but one that the audience seemed to appreciate. I hope you do as well. It's being released simultaneously across EBC, my other pod Scrubbing the Sky, and Naeem's Carbon Curve. If you subscribe to all three, you'll get it in triplicate. Enjoy the show. So, Greg, you've been, through your purchase, you've been very public about on the need for carbon removal and the boosting of the carbon removal industry. How can you put this need for CDR in greater context from where you sit?
Yeah, I always like to simply start by the consciousness level we need on concentration levels. So, humanity, civilization was built on 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's probably the most stable period of climate, and that allowed the world as we know it to arrive. Over the past 200 years, and during the industrialization age, we've essentially pumped an additional, call it 50 parts per million in the atmosphere, and that's when I was born. It was 330 parts per million. Today we're at 430, so I'm an additional 100 during my lifetime. So that's why I say it's our generation needs to fix this. We don't have time for the next generation to fix it. The need for removal is obvious when you look at it on a concentration level, but it's needed also from the simple net zero concept. And the net zero concept, which is adopted by all countries in the world, except some for now, but is also law in Canada, requires not only the decarbonization, which needs to be the priority. We need to reduce our emissions, and needs to go from about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent now, maybe a little bit more, all the way down to the maximum extent. And that maximum decarbonization probably bring us to maybe 10 gigatons of remaining emissions, maybe 8, maybe 6, maybe 12. It doesn't matter. Whatever is left to get to net zero, you need the negative emissions to compensate for that. That's carbon removal. So we need it for the net zero piece, and we need it to go to historical emissions and clean up our act of the past many years and decades.
Yep. And just to build on that, Greg, my podcast co-host, David Keefe, published an op-ed in the New York Times, and it talked about there's only two ways to cool the planet in our lifetimes. And I think this is useful too. And that if we get to net zero, we could just be crystallizing an unacceptable level of warming, even if we get there by 2050 or 2060. And 2.5 degrees of warming might be bad for a lot of places that are already hot and poor today. To cool the planet, you have to do one of two things: drop CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, which is the palatable approach, or something like solar geoengineering, reflecting sunlight back in, which is much more controversial. Naeem, so some people talk about carbon removal as being like a distraction from what we need to do. Yeah. They say, mitigation, let's say that's, 99% of our effort, adaptation is 1% of their effort, and anything talking about carbon removal, it's just a distraction. The tech entrepreneurs love it. They fund it. You should stop doing it and just focus on energy efficiency and renewables and industrial efficiency and all those things. What, in your role as the head of Carbon Removal Canada, what do you say?
I mean, I would trade some of the hype that's been around carbon removal for investment any day. Because if you think about the last year in terms of the investment made in the clean energy transition of over $2 trillion US dollars, a fraction of 1% of that went to carbon removal. So when we're talking about the scales of what we need to do here in terms of billions of tons of CO2 removal to get to net zero, and then many more billions to start cleaning up our act so we don't just lock in the temperature that we have when we get to net zero, these are massive scales. And we're doing and investing very little. And if we think about carbon removal as maybe 10 or 20% of the problem at the end, we're nowhere near putting anything like 10 or 20% of our investment into carbon removal today insofar as the overall clean energy transition. So my view is, I think that people might be getting this idea, this like kind of the tech interest around carbon removal and some of the media that you do see around it, to the extent that people are aware of carbon removal at all and think it's kind of a distraction. But when it comes down to the numbers, we're just really not doing a lot of it, and we're not investing enough money in carbon removal. And so my view is that priority number one is reducing emissions. We have to do that rapidly and aggressively across the economy. But we're going to hit a point where we're going to need carbon removal to compensate for the rest of those emissions, and we're not going to be able to just turn that on in a day, right? If it is 10 or 20% of the remaining emissions that we need to counterbalance with carbon removal, well, 10 to 20% of a large number is still a very large number. Individually, carbon removal is kind of like, think how much solar we need or how much wind we need. Like, that's the scales that we're talking about. And so when we, think about the role for carbon removal, it is we need to start building this today. We need to start using it today. We need to learn how to make the technology better, how to get the costs down, how to build public trust, how to create policies to support the sector. Like, we have a lot to do over the next, few decades if we have any chance of getting to net zero with carbon removal that we are just not doing at this point. And the last thing I'll say about this is, if you do have concerns about, the role that carbon removal plays potentially distracting from the things we need to do to reduce emissions to reach our climate goals, like, come talk to me. Come work with us, collaborate with us, support us in some way. Because at Carbon Removal Canada, our goal as a independent group that's not industry affiliated, our goal is, how do we use carbon removal to accelerate our climate plans so it's not contributing to business as usual or just a distraction in any way? How is it additive to our collective goals to address climate change? That's why we exist. So I'd love to work with anyone who actually has some of those concerns.
Yeah, and I find often you have to make the point, and you think it's an obvious point, but no one is saying don't do mitigation.
Right.
It's like, and I still say, listen, if your carbon budget's $100, spend 98, 99 bucks on mitigation,
right,
but it starts spending that dollar now on something like carbon removal and ramp that up. Greg, so Naeem just said we're not doing enough of it. You're a banker. You help industries to scale. You do that through your portfolio of companies. So what do we need to do? Like, what's not happening that needs to happen in order for more projects to really get going?
Well, first, we need to get out of our own way. So we'll have to trust. There is a moral pitfall here of saying, if we have this, are we going to do the rest? We will. Like, everyone I know that works on carbon removal is really focused on this being in addition and at the end of our decarbonization path. What we need to do, first, people need to understand what we're talking about here. This has the potential, in fact, has the necessity of being the largest industry in the world. When you think of the quantification of those numbers, so 10 gigatons that remains in emissions to compensate at net zero, McKinsey said that's about $1.2 trillion in revenue a year in carbon markets. That is not the size of the oil industry, but not far. But that is not addressing yet the historical emissions we were talking about. And when you think about bringing back down emission concentration levels from 500 ppm, let's say, all the way down to 350, which would be a safe level, that's easily 800 to 1,000 gigatons. So I was saying net zero is 10 gigatons. We need 1,000 gigatons removed from the atmosphere. So that 1.2 trillion I was talking about times 100. It's enormous. There is a destination that requires this. So we are going to have these industries. They are defined as different subsectors in carbon removal, but they will exist. They will be at scale. There is no other path in any of the IPCC decarbonization plans and net zero paths. So there is an opportunity for investment. This is an industry that will exist. And we'll talk about the markets, the buyers, the policies that we need to get there. But just figuring that out, people need to accept the fact there's a large industry, and Canada has all the attributes to be a world leader in this.
Okay, well, Canada has the attributes, Naeem. What you said, and I hear that said, that it could be this very large industry. It could be, something comparable. I was going to say the largest industry in the world I thought was banking, but it has this great potential. But what is the Canadian opportunity? And when we say it could be this great Canadian opportunity with the space or the people we know how to turn wrenches, how is that not hype? Because that's the other criticism I hear, that we're peak hype cycle on carbon removal now.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a fair question. I moved back to Canada because I believe that Canada has the opportunity to lead in carbon removal. And we have to define what that leadership role actually means, right? Like we can't just be talking indiscriminately about scale. We have to be focused and ambitious. And so that's what we're trying to work out now. What is a focused opportunity for Canada to play a major leading role? What's exciting about carbon removal in Canada and why I want folks to think about this as an opportunity in Canada is because there's this narrative that, well, Canada's a small country. Our emissions are 1 or 2% of global emissions, so we're not going to make that big of a difference with just reducing emissions, which we should absolutely still do. But with carbon removal, it's an opportunity for Canada to have an outsized impact on the global climate challenge, right? It's an opportunity to do even more. The sky is literally the limit when it comes to carbon removal. And so when we think about Canada and the natural advantages it has, think, the large landmass, the long coastlines, all of the relevant industries that play into the different subsectors of carbon removal, all of those things are working to our advantage. And so the question is, can we get the political will and can we drive our ambition towards something that really makes sense for Canada to play a leading role? And that at Carbon Removal Canada, like our job right now is, charting out what that path can look like for Canada to be a global leader in this space, and for us as a country to leave behind a legacy on climate change that we can be really proud of.
Great. And I think we're going to get into some more details about what the Canadian government in particular can do. But now it's that time of the show when I pass the hosting baton to my friend and fellow podcast host, Naeem of The Carbon Curve. Check it out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen. And you're going to take over the hosting chair.
Yeah, and I guess I'll do that with the 13 minutes we have left. And Ed, you've done an amazing job.
Is that time right? Do we really off at 2:00?
We'll extend.
We'll extend. Yeah, there we go.
Ed, you've been asking us all the questions so far. You've been thinking about carbon removal longer than most people I know, and certainly in the Canadian context. How do you think about scaling carbon removal and Canada's role in all of this?
I think, thank you for that question. That's an excellent question. It's a pretty exciting time for carbon removal in Canada right now. And you can't separate the exciting time we have from what's happening in the United States. And unfortunately, we're going through a bit of a blowback period for climate. It looked like it was going to be global. I think we put a stop to that, but certainly in the United States under the new administration. And you contrast that now with what the Canadian government is doing in terms of trying to make carbon removal, trying to make Canada a leader and make it a carbon removal hub in Canada. And given this little consultancy that I'm putting together and all the amazing carbon removal companies that I work with and the buyers, it's incredible. I thought it was, like myself, peak hype cycle in Canada when we said, well, what we're just talking about, that we've got the trades, we've got the capital, we have gigatons upon gigatons of storage space, but we're going to be a little player and no one's going to take notice. That is wrong.
Yeah.
Like the number of inbounds that, just myself and my colleagues are getting now about interest in developing in Canada because of those three attributes, and all of it now aided by supportive policy and regulatory framework, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So I think that's exciting. It's also a bit worrisome. And it's a bit worrisome because we're going through what I call the Cambrian explosion of carbon removal companies. And that is, there's a new carbon removal company, I think, every week. And sorry, not to denigrate any of these fine carbon removal companies that we have in the audience today, but we're going through this tremendous explosion. And I think particularly in the U.S. now, with the U.S. stepping back, pulling back some of its supports in its loan program, but also now, for all we know, one of its key supports, the 45Q production tax credit, might be pulled off the table, then we're going to see a reckoning, and that reckoning is going to really take root next year. But that's bad for companies that operate across the border, but it's great for Canada if we have the Carney government do what the Prime Minister himself says he wants Canada to do, is that a step forward and claim that leadership mantle. I think we can reverse the brain drain and get a lot of folks coming up here developing projects here in Canada. And then, as Greg, you said, we just got to get out of our own ways.
That's right.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Greg, I got to say, that was a pretty boss move there, just buying us a bit more time without really checking and just on the fly there. But
Privilege of sponsoring the event.
Yeah.
and another boss move is BMO's acquisition of Radical. And then in result of that, you guys have gotten really deep in connected to the buyers and sellers of carbon credits. Tell me about your view of the role of the voluntary carbon market and the compliance market in Canada as it relates to carbon removal.
Yeah. So about 2 years ago, BMO closed on the acquisition of Radical. So we have dozens of people working the carbon markets day in, day out. Of course, nature-based solutions, novel solutions. And one of the questions I often get is when we think of carbon removal at scale, is that really going to be paid by the private sector? Or is that a government service? And the answer is, when you think of taxpayers paying for historical emissions, everyone cringes. And when you say, well, no, but the private sector is going to pay, and everyone in the private sector sort of cringes. And the answer is both. What form is that going to take? Well, we have voluntary carbon markets and we have compliance markets. Right now, it's interesting. The World in Data says there's about 24% of world emissions under carbon pricing right now. That's pretty encouraging. And that was very different 5 and 10 years ago. So these things, they're shaping up more and more, these markets. There has been, if we take the voluntary carbon markets, there's been issues both for buyers and for projects that have removed the credibility of many, many projects over the past few years. But those are normal learning curves of any market. If you think of securities market, derivatives market, when they were set up, there's all sorts of fraud and issues, unfortunately. And those get fixed. And we put processes and measurement systems. So MRV is advancing very quickly in carbon removal in all types of spaces. And it's going to be part of those answers. So we're going to be able, Radical does that, we're going to be able to deliver very credible, well-verified credits to buyers. And we're there to accompany those buyers to make safe purchases. So how does that get done? Well, buying credits shouldn't be just something done off a desk without a real strategy. And that strategy needs to come with a full decarbonization plan, a real decarbonization targets. And then as you start to use credit, there are new concepts that people are getting familiar with that we are pushing about like for like. Make sure your emissions start to resemble more and more the emissions that you actually push into the atmosphere. If you cut down trees, it's okay to reforest. But if you put emissions from burning fuel into the atmosphere, planting a tree doesn't quite have the exact same effect day one. So you need to transition over time toward that net zero goal in a way that transitions your emission removals towards something that resembles your remaining emissions. So there's a lot of these trends, and we're there to accompany our clients down that path. And over time, these voluntary markets, when we have enough CDR in the supply system, they may merge over time with compliance systems. And then that's how you price the externality into the entire capitalism system we work with.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a really interesting way to think about how it fits and in the whole picture and actually kind of, connected to that. Ed, I wanted to talk about an initiative that you've been leading and that we at Carbon Removal Canada have been, happy to support, which is aiming to bring, big corporates along and commit to buying permanent carbon removal with the context that Grégoire just gave us in mind. Can you share more about that? Can you tell us about this commitment mechanism?
Sure. I'd love to talk about it. It's called advanced carbon removal. And its goal, what we wake up and think about in the morning, is how do we inject $100 million in new capital into the Canadian CDR ecosystem? Maybe some in the audience here are familiar with an initiative, a buyer's initiative called Frontier. We're trying to build something very similar here in Canada. Or maybe you're familiar with what organizations like Gavi in countries like Canada, other G7 countries, France, and the United States did to really help the deployment of pneumococcal vaccines in sub-Saharan Africa in the early 2000s. What they did is they brought together buyers willing to say, hey, if you develop this, and let's take the pneumococcal vaccine as an example, we're going to guarantee you offtake. We're going to sort of set aside money so that if you bring it to market, we'll buy it. And in the vaccine world, it ended up being very successful, and hundreds of thousands of lives were saved as a result, and especially amongst children who are most vulnerable, susceptible to pneumococcal disease. We're trying to do the same with carbon removal. Mitch Selby from Shopify is over there. They're part of this group called Frontier, which started with $2 billion of commitments that some of the carbon removal companies, project developers in this room have benefited from. And we're trying to right-size it for a Canadian market, so not 2 billion, 100 million, but working with, well, Greg's bank, working with other of the big 5 banks, talking to Shopify, talking to airlines, to pull together a commitment, a starting point. It won't be the full 100 million, but a commitment to say, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it together. And the really important linchpin that we have in place that didn't exist or doesn't exist in the US is that we've got the Canadian government, which itself has committed to government procurement of CDR as kind of like the bedrock. So governments moving together with companies, what you're talking about, Greg, moving joined at the hip. And that initiative, we're in discussions with all those entities. And what we hope to do, Naeem, is launch at the Energy and Environment Ministerial, the G7 Ministerial. That's going to be happening, once again, 30 kilometers from where I live in Alberta. I've just come from Canmore, by the way, where the fighter jets were flying sorties every 6 minutes above Canmore. It's very exciting, very exciting. Breathing the same rarefied air as the great orange one, so to speak. But we're going to launch that in October with, at the same time as what we hope to launch a multinational government advanced market commitment initiative as well.
Okay, so there's a lot of interest, not just among corporates, but around governments to, they understand the need here. And now it's figuring out how do we operate this in a coordinated fashion, whether it's between corporates or major governments, to support the carbon removal sector, provide that revenue certainty that's needed in order to grow the sector the way that the solar sector probably grew from similar types of initiatives, or the costs were able to come down significantly with vaccines, for example.
Bingo, spoken as almost as if you're hosting that very initiative inside Carbon Removal Canada.
We're happy to, and we're proud of the work that's been done so far, but it's helpful to understand how all these things come together. And all of this is happening in the context of, which I think you would agree, are some headwinds around climate right now. And so, Grégoire, I'd love to know, what are the implications, in the markets right now that you're seeing, and what are some innovations and developments that you're excited about with this backdrop?
So I'll answer this very quickly and steal the podcast host baton from you, and then ask your question as well, Naeem. But the short answer is there are ways to be a buyer in the carbon markets today, acting safely with the right strategy. And that's where advisors like BMO Radical, that's what we do. How do we do this? Well, first, there's baskets of credits that we create to protect our clients. I was talking about the concept of evolving toward a certain profile of emissions, negative emissions that reflect your emissions profile. That's essentially the Oxford Principles, which we work with at BMO. So we can advise you down that path. And there are ways, despite the political environment, to be able to play as a buyer, catalyzing the sector. But to catalyze the sector, so Naeem, let me ask you, private capital needs to be deployed for these companies to find their way. But there's policy risk.
Yeah.
And that policy risk brings uncertainty. So what would you like to do from Carbon Removal Canada's standpoint in terms of policies in Canada to accelerate the sector?
Yeah, we at Carbon Removal Canada, we see policy as the most important lever right now to help scale the carbon removal kind of sector in Canada. That policy certainty is absolutely critical. And we were working with the Liberal campaign prior to the election to include carbon removal, which we were able to do amongst other partners that were kind of talking to the government about this, about the importance of carbon removal and making Canada a global leader. And we're really excited that it made into that platform. And we hope that we can help the government actually execute on that policy agenda. But there's a few that I'll really highlight that I think are really critically important in terms of policies. One is carbon removal targets. So right now, when you think about the targets that we need to achieve to get to net zero as a country, we don't have anything specific around carbon removal. We don't talk about the role of carbon removal in getting to net zero, let alone have any kind of quantified targets. Now, it's targets can have benefits, and they can be accurate or inaccurate. But the point is that it provides some degree of buy-in. It shows some buy-in from the government, and it provides that certainty that this is important to the Canadian government as part of our agenda, and can be a North Star for developing coherent policies. The second thing that we're trying to do is expand tax credits that already exist in Canada to support more carbon removal methods and extend those tax credits out. And that's also in the Liberal platform. And that's what's exciting about that is that it helps get the economics of carbon removal to a place where projects can get built And when we build projects and we continue to do it over and over and over again, those iterations help us drive down the cost of new technologies. That's how every technology has come down the cost curve. And so those tax credits to help get projects deployed are going to be really critical to making that happen and getting carbon removal to the price that we need it to be at. And then finally, I'll leave the most important for last, but revenue certainty. Revenue certainty is really critical to companies in the carbon removal space. And so we're looking to embed carbon removal in our compliance markets in Canada. We were able to advocate for the government of Canada themselves to buy carbon removal credits from Canadian suppliers to help reduce the emissions intensity of the government's operations, and the RFP around that will be happening in the next several months. So that's been really exciting, but we're thinking a lot about how do we create revenue certainty for the carbon removal sector so that they can get bankable investment and grow their companies.
Well, those would be great. Ed, I'm sure you watched the election platform of the Carney government in detail. What have you observed in there that you're expecting gets delivered, and what's missing and from a policy perspective?
First, there's a lot of good things, and it was a very pleasant surprise when, climate wasn't a big factor in that platform. It wasn't a factor at all in the Conservative Party's platform, and climate didn't play as strong a role as it's played in previous elections, but we had lots of good things in there for carbon removal, which is a pleasant surprise. But full credit to Naim and his team for being able to work closely with the Carney team to get those in. And it just such a credit to Carbon Removal Canada, and it's made such a difference compared to, and I see Laurie Gaytree in the audience from Carbon Engineering. Carbon Engineering used to be sort of the group, and it's got this tremendous success story with the Stratos plants and the technology that's being used down there for pure saline sequestration of going up to 500 kilotons. But it used to be the only voice really for carbon removal in Canada when we started working. And now we've got a multitude of voices. That's a roundabout way, Greg, of saying good things. However, what we would like to see is what Naim mentioned, a clear link to carbon removal and into compliance markets. So the clean fuel regulation is probably the clearest way. And back when I was working with Carbon Engineering, we had direct air capture into the CFS when it was a CFS. And then the feds pulled it out. They can easily put it back in under the CFR, and that would create a great link. Yeah. I'd also like to see greater links to the Canada Growth Fund and the Canada Infrastructure Program as well. I think I'd like to see recapitalization of the Energy Innovation Program to the tune of $100 million. And I'd like to see Low Carbon Fuel Procurement Program, which is the fund that the government is using to go and procure carbon removal credits. I'd like to see that 10x'd. Yeah. It's 10 million right now. It should be capitalized with 100 million. And that would really help to inject even more capital into the carbon removal ecosystem in Canada. Lastly, this is a big wish list, but we're greedy because we got momentum and we want to be the world leading jurisdiction. We should seriously consider a production tax credit as well. Yeah. So the U.S. could very well pull back its production tax credit. I really hope not. But regardless of that, Canada could step forward, and that's a world-leading instrument to really drive carbon removal projects on the ground.
That is a great list. Naim, I'll let you react to it. Is that the right thing, not only to address the environmental necessity, but also to catalyze Canada as a differentiated country in terms of industrial policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's the right list. And, I think we all have a lot of work to do within the carbon removal space to advocate for all of those policies, because we have a window of opportunity. We have a window of opportunity right now. We had an opportunity to host Carbon Removal Day a few months ago. We get, 200 actors across the ecosystem, government, industry, corporates, investors, nonprofit, civil society, to talk about the role of carbon removal in Canada going forward. And the overall message was, we have this window. Let's not waste it. We have an opportunity to leapfrog and be a global leader in carbon removal. And that's important to think about, because that economic imperative is absolutely critical in the context that we're in right now, right? We have trade conflicts happening. There's a lot of uncertainty around our economy, and overcoming some of these challenges is not just going to be about improving trade relations with existing industries. It's about Canada leading in new industries. That's part of how we address some of the economic challenges that we're facing today. And what's exciting about carbon removal is, in a way that's maybe not true for other clean technologies, leadership in carbon removal right now is still up for grabs. Like, I don't think any one country just has a lock on developing and building out technologies for carbon removal right now. So this is an area where we can realistically lead. And so the differentiator for Canada, based on those policies that you talked about, Ed, and there's a few more that we can probably drum up as well, is that we see Canada as being a hub for credibility in the carbon removal market globally, right? We are investing in credible science. We are building commercially viable companies. We are establishing high integrity standards for development of carbon removal. We are seen as a place for high quality carbon removal around the world that is actually accelerating our climate goals and our progress towards those climate goals. And all of that is really critical because I think when we think about the biggest barrier to scaling carbon removal, I think it's trust. Like, I think it's trust that we can do this well. Long term, that's what I think it's going to be. And I think Canada can play a really important role in establishing that trust and building out this sector with scale and doing it responsibly. I think Canada is well positioned to do that, and it can be an amazing economic driver as a result. We've done some analysis around this in terms of the job creation and GDP growth that can come from a fully scaled carbon removal sector. There's something like 140 billion added to our GDP and 89,000 jobs if we built an at-scale carbon removal sector in Canada. So this can be something that we are, again, really proud of, and it can be an important legacy for our country if we decide to make the decision and invest in this space.
That's an exciting thesis. Ed, I'll let you react. I'm getting a kick out of being a podcast host for a second, but I'll pass you the baton to react to this. Maybe talk about the fall agenda as we're entering that phase in the next ministerial cycle, and for you to close on our panel today.
Sounds good. But I do want to say, Naeem, isn't he a great podcast host?
He's doing great.
BMO,
stay tuned.
BMO folks, Caroline, get him a podcast.
The comms team needs to get on that. Yeah.
It's in the works.
Yeah. It can't just be John Stackhouse who has a good podcast.
It's in the works.
Yeah. And we're blanking. It's flashing overtime here. I kind of wish we went into overtime last night.
I know.
That didn't happen. Listen, it's a great time. There's lots of momentum. We're going to hit some challenges. I talked about this buyers group that we're pulling together with the Government of Canada and with leading companies, including BMO being a prominent part of that discussion. And I alluded to it, we're doing something similar at the multinational level with this anchor of its own commitments and combining that with its G7 presidency to convince other G7 countries, or I would say in this case G6 countries, to follow suit and themselves commit to government procurement of carbon removal. So we've got the two initiatives, and if we play our cards right and the Government of Canada gets lots of support from folks in this room, some of you already have, saying, let's do this, let's make this a priority. We get that on that fall Energy and Environment Ministerial on the agenda, and then we get a commitment. And the good news is the Government of Canada, its great foreign affairs officials are already working diplomatic channels hard to try to pull this off. It won't be G7. It won't be a G7 initiative. It's going to be, at best, a G6 initiative. But man, even if we had 2 to 3 countries willing to step out and take leadership and say, we're doing this, then you pull along a few more from COP. And next thing you know, we've got countries working together to drive government procurement at the same time as companies are working together to drive corporate procurement of carbon removal. And if we can do that, hey, we're going to get a lot more carbon removal projects done.
That's terrific.
All right. Overtime, please wrap up. I'm going to wrap up on behalf of the panel. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Naeem. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Amit Tandon. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the Trottier Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, the Palmer Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. We'll be back on July 3rd with well-known atmospheric scientist Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a distinguished professor and endowed chair at Texas Tech University. See you then.